Newly sworn-in U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi just announced a federal lawsuit against Illinois and Chicago over their sanctuary policies to harbor illegal migrants from federal immigration authorities. This is a clear shot across the bow of all the many sanctuary cities and states across the nation.
Let me start with you've cracked down on sanctuary cities. The DOJ has put a pause on all federal funding to sanctuary cities and states. You filed a lawsuit against Chicago and the state of Illinois for being a sanctuary city. Am I wrong in my interpretation that a sanctuary city is aiding and abetting in lawbreaking?
Sean, what they're doing is they are choosing illegal aliens over the safety and security of their own citizens and the men and women of law enforcement who are out there trying to protect their citizens. Not only did we sue today the city of Chicago, we sued the state of Illinois, we sued the mayor, we sued the governor, and we sued others. And let me be very clear, if you don't comply with federal law, you're going to be next.
So this is certainly a step, I would say a baby step, in the right direction by the Trump administration to deal with the 100 million or so illegal migrants infesting our country. But is it enough? I say heck no. As the protest chant goes, what do we want? Real sanctuary accountability. When do we want it? Now. I mean, the joy Americans are experiencing watching the 100 million illegal migrants finally being deported home can only be described as exuberance. Here's one guy literally watching ICE raid his illegal migrant neighbors across the street.
ICE is raiding the neighbors. No way. Hell yeah, yo.
Yeah, dude, they're for real, man.
I love it, dude.
Big crank it down.
I love it.
That'd be it, right?
I'm loving it. It's ICE.
It's gotta be, right?
It is. Dude, I love it. Thank God. I've been waiting for this.
Yo, dude.
Holy shit.
They got the ICE motel too, right?
Do they really?
Yeah, sure.
I saw the lights and I'm like, yo, no way is it ICE.
I'm like, yo, this is crazy, man.
Holy
It's about time we got some justice, man.
hell yeah, brother. Good for you. Be warm out there, okay? Holy they stopped the whole bus. Oh my God.
And I'm right there with this guy. For anybody asking if I'm regretting my vote for Trump, my only regret is that he's not doing more, harder, faster. And that's especially true on the illegal migrant front. Let's talk about it. I am, of course, Attorney Andrew Branca for Law of Self-Defense. Hey, folks, I want to take just a moment to invite you all to our upcoming live and 100% free Law of Self-Defense Hard to Convict webinar. This free webinar teaches you how to be hard to convict if you're ever compelled to use force in defense of yourself, your family, or your property. The webinar is live streamed by me personally, and there's plenty of opportunity for Q&A. Best of all, it's 100% free, but we do limit seats to allow for adequate Q&A. So I urge you to grab your seat right now by signing up at lawofselfdefense.com/hard-to-convict. So U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi just filed a federal lawsuit against the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago. Both the office of the mayor as well as the head of the Chicago Police Department and other city officials. I'll dive into the specific demands of that lawsuit in just a moment. And of course, links to that and every other document and statute we talk about today will be included in the description. But in general, the lawsuit asks the federal court to prohibit the state and city and departments from engaging in various immigrant sanctuary policies. This lawsuit came one day after Bondi's Department of Justice issued a memorandum over her own signature ordering a number of internal DOJ actions be taken against sanctuary jurisdictions generally. So the scope of the memo is the entire nation, not merely Illinois and Chicago, like with the lawsuit. I actually find the memo more substantive than the lawsuit that was just filed, but let's address the lawsuit first. The lawsuit notes up front that immigration law falls exclusively within the jurisdiction of the federal government, not that of the states, and above and beyond the legal doctrine that federal law is generally supreme over state law where the two conflict. Both the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago have put in place various sanctuary laws, ordinances, procedures to willfully not comply with the efforts of federal law enforcement to enforce the nation's immigration laws. And it's these sanctuary laws, ordinances, and procedures that the Department of Justice finds objectionable. For example, it's been traditionally the case that the federal immigration authorities would be notified by local law enforcement if an arrest was made of a person who turned out to be an illegal migrant, or if an illegal migrant in custody was about to be released. The federal immigration authorities can then place what's called a detainer on that illegal migrant, and local law enforcement would retain custody of that person until ICE could show up and take them into federal custody. The sanctuary policies adopted by Illinois and Chicago prohibit any such communication or cooperation between local law enforcement and immigration authorities. So instead of the arrested illegal migrants being detained for immigration, they are instead released onto the streets. The entire purpose of these sanctuary provisions is, of course, to interfere with the federal immigration authority ability to process and deport these illegal migrants. The Department of Justice lawsuit complains that these sanctuary provisions intentionally obstruct the sharing of information, including basic information such as release dates and custodial status, thereby impairing federal detention of removable aliens, including dangerous criminals, as required by federal law. The Department of Justice then argues that the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution, the legal doctrine that holds federal laws supreme over state or local laws, prohibits Illinois and Chicago from obstructing the federal government's ability to enforce laws that Congress has enacted. The lawsuit then goes into some dozen pages of specifics, but wraps up with its three requests for the trial court. First, the Department of Justice asked the court to issue an order finding that the sanctuary policies of Illinois and Chicago violate the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and therefore these sanctuary policies are invalid as unconstitutional. Second, the Department of Justice asked the court to issue an order finding that the sanctuary policies of Illinois and Chicago also violate federal statute, specifically 8 U.S.C. 1373, that prohibits local government interference with any communication from a local government entity to federal immigration authorities, and therefore sanctuary policies are invalid as a violation of federal law. Now, important note here, that statute, 1373, is a civil federal statute, not a criminal federal statute. So a violation cannot be criminally prosecuted. That means a violation cannot earn prison time, but only fines. And those fines would generally be ultimately paid by the taxpayer, not personally by the governor or mayor or police chief. This is important. I'll circle back to it in a moment. The third request of the lawsuit, really as a result of the first two demands, the Department of Justice asked the court to issue a permanent injunction on Illinois and Chicago prohibiting them from enforcing their sanctuary policies. So the argument is that sanctuary laws are invalid as unconstitutional and also invalid as a violation of federal law, and therefore should be prohibited for local authorities to enforce those sanctuary policies to the detriment of federal immigration authorities. Note that although this lawsuit is specific to Illinois and Chicago, an unfavorable result for them here on their sanctuary laws would surely lead the Department of Justice to make the same arguments against all sanctuary jurisdictions. Now, what about Bondi's Department of Justice memo about sanctuary policies generally, issued the day prior to the lawsuit against Illinois and Chicago? And the memo is entitled Sanctuary Jurisdiction Directives. The memo is effectively an internal order to Department of Justice personnel and has three major initiatives. First, it targets local government jurisdictions, so states, cities, counties, that have sanctuary laws or policies in effect, and it cuts these off from any federal grants, monies, administered by the Department of Justice. So this is a strike at the wallets of the sanctuary government jurisdictions. I don't have a good way to know how big a strike, but based on my professional experience, I would expect jurisdictions like Illinois and Chicago to currently be receiving in the many tens of millions of dollars worth of grants through the Department of Justice for various purposes. Second, the memo targets non-governmental agencies, NGOs, engaged in providing support services to illegal migrants, many of whom also receive sizable Department of Justice grants. This part of the order freezes funds to these NGOs for 60 days during which time they are to report to the DOJ the precise nature of the services they provide illegal migrants. Then the Department of Justice will review those services and decide whether those NGOs continue to get their funding through the Department of Justice or whether that funding ends. Again, it should be expected that these monies will be very substantial. Third, the Department of Justice memo directs local U.S. attorneys' offices around the nation to evaluate whether jurisdictions enforcing sanctuary policies are in violation of federal law, and provides a non-exclusive list of several example statutes that might be being broken, such as 18 U.S.C. 371, 8 U.S.C. 1324, and 8 U.S.C. 1373. Importantly, Pam Bondi is smart enough to know that a lot of local Department of Justice personnel living in the same pro-sanctuary communities as the governments and NGOs being assessed might merely do a pretextual evaluation, wave their hands a bit, and conclude that these are not the sanctuary policies the DOJ is looking for, and therefore decline to pursue any DOJ actions against those sanctuary jurisdictions. Bondi addresses this risk by requiring in her memo that any declination decisions with respect to any effort to obstruct or fail to comply with a lawful immigration-related directive from the executive branch shall be promptly reported back to Bondi. In other words, she's telling the local DOJ personnel, hey, if you look at your locale's sanctuary policy and decide to not pursue DOJ action against them, you don't just get to bury that declination conclusion in a file cabinet in your local office. That decision to not pursue DOJ action against those sanctuary policies must be promptly reported back to Bondi at DOJ HQ for their own evaluation of your decision-making process. And that's great. That's really just good management practice, because without higher level authority monitoring and without accountability, it's impossible to have any faith in the credibility of this kind of evaluation process. Now, as I mentioned, this part of the memo mentions several statutes specifically, so let's take a look at those. 8 U.S.C. 1373, we already looked at in the context of the lawsuit I mentioned. That's the one that creates a civil but not criminal offense for local governments interfering with the communication of illegal migrant information to federal authorities. Here's the problem with these civil remedies. They're completely inadequate accountability. Effectively, all you can do is issue a fine. But generally, these fines are not issued to the governor or mayor or police chief in their personal capacity, but in their official capacity. In fact, the lawsuit itself is very explicit about this. The lawsuit is brought against Illinois Governor Pritzker, Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson, and Chicago Police Superintendent Larry Snelling, and others, all in their official capacity. That means if a fine is levied, it's not paid by the individual, but by the government entity for which he works. Pritzker's fines are paid for by the taxpayers of Illinois, Johnson's by the taxpayers of Chicago, and so forth. And politicians are always happy to spend other people's money to make their own political problems go away. The threat of mere fines imposes absolutely zero accountability on any of these politicians enforcing these sanctuary policies. Now, the two other statutes mentioned in the memo are more promising because these are criminal offenses for which criminal prosecution, jail time, and even worse might be the result. 18 U.S.C. 371, for example, deals with conspiracy to commit an offense against the United States. Essentially, a conspiracy is simply when two or more people agree to violate some law, and then any of them commit some act to actually engage in the conduct. So it's more than just talk. This would apply to any two or more people agreeing to a violation of any U.S. immigration law. If the law in question is a felony crime, then the conspiracy is itself a federal felony, punishable by up to 5 years in prison. That's entirely independent of the underlying crime. Conspiracy is its own crime. The other statute mentioned, 8 U.S.C. 1324, also a federal criminal statute, is particularly promising for the purpose of holding sanctuary authorities accountable. It prohibits the harboring, providing safety or shelter, or concealing or shielding from detection, or any attempt to do any of that, of an illegal immigrant. Such concealment, harboring, shielding from detection is, of course, the very core purpose of sanctuary laws. So it's hard to imagine any government official enforcing a sanctuary policy not being in violation of 1324. What makes 1324 particularly interesting is the severity of the punishments. Just about any violation of 1324 in harboring an illegal migrant or shielding from detection carries a federal prison sentence of 5 years. Presumably, that's per criminal count. And of course, any government official enforcing a sanctuary policy is presumably enforcing that policy to effect the concealment, harboring, and shielding from detection, not a single illegal migrant, but hundreds or thousands of illegal migrants, and each would be a separate count. But what happens if an illegal migrant who is concealed, harbored, shielded from detection under sanctuary policies ends up released back into the streets and causes someone serious bodily injury or places someone in jeopardy of losing their life? This could just be an aggravated assault or even just a drunk driving violation. In that case, any person who participated in the concealment, harboring, shielding from detection is looking at 20 years in federal prison, not just 5. And again, that would be for each count. 20 years in a federal penitentiary isn't any fun at all, and 20 years times X number of counts, even less so. And certainly many illegal migrants released onto the streets under sanctuary laws have gone on to cause serious bodily injury or have placed others in jeopardy of losing their life. But it gets even more interesting. What if an illegal migrant who was concealed, harbored, shielded from detection under sanctuary policies ends up released back onto the street and causes the actual death of another person? In that case, any person who participated in the concealment, harboring, or shielding from detection of that illegal migrant is facing capital punishment, execution. And sadly, far too many illegal migrants released onto the streets under sanctuary laws have gone on to cause the death of another person. Now, it's worth pointing out that while the DOJ sanctuary memo lists those 3 statutes specifically, that list was not exclusive. There are other federal criminal laws that can also be brought to bear. 18 U.S.C. 1510, for example, deals with the act of obstructing, delaying, or preventing the communication of information related to any violation of a federal criminal statute. So it's clearly applicable to sanctuary policies, and it's good for 5 years in prison. 18 U.S.C. 2384 deals with the act of, by force, preventing, hindering, or delaying the execution of any federal law. So it's clearly applicable to anyone who facilitates sanctuary policies using physical force. That would apply to protesters too, and that one's good for 20 years in prison. And I'm sure a thorough examination of federal law would disclose even more applicable criminal statutes. The point is that AG Pam Bondi and the Department of Justice have plenty of arrows in their quiver to criminally pursue these sanctuary policy miscreants and present them with an offer they ought not be able to refuse. Cease and desist all sanctuary policies inconsistent with the immigration law of the U.S., or suffer criminal prosecution and consequences, including potentially execution. One would think that threats of federal prison sentences of 5 years or 20 years, or the potential of capital punishment, would give substantial pause to local officials enforcing sanctuary policies. Certainly, it would do more than any civil penalties that are paid for by taxpayers rather than by themselves. If prison or execution is on the table, now those sanctuary officials finally have some personal skin in the game, literally their own skin. Here's the problem. None of the sanctuary policy officials actually believe these criminal sanctions are a real risk to them. They think it's all grandstanding, and therefore they can safely ignore the risk. After all, have we yet seen even impotent civil penalties actually be imposed rather than just threatened on these sanctuary officials? And if the United States is unwilling to exact even civil penalties on sanctuary politicians, why should anybody believe they would be willing to criminally prosecute, imprison, and potentially execute sanctuary politicians? The surest way to undermine your own authority is to give orders that everybody believes you will not enforce, and then don't enforce them. After that, you're just a clown that everybody ignores as they go about doing whatever they like to do, and nothing changes. If the Department of Justice, under Attorney General Pam Bondi, and by extension, President Trump himself, wants to see actual substantive changes in how local governments handle the administration of legal migrants in their custody, if they want to see the enforcement of sanctuary policies ended, then they need to start holding these sanctuary officials accountable in a very public and obvious manner, and while holding serious threats above their heads. Certainly, the Biden administration's Department of Justice and Federal Bureau of Investigation never hesitated to send AR rifle armed squads in the dead of night into the homes of people who'd merely been invited into the Capitol building on January 6th. They never hesitated to conduct raids of President Trump's own home. We've all seen Trump's mugshot demanded by the less progressive kangaroo courts. If the Trump administration is to preserve its credibility on immigration matters generally and its opposition to sanctuary policies specifically, it must act with at least equal vigor in targeting the local government officials enforcing those sanctuary policies. Send a squad of federal law enforcement armed with rifles and sworn arrest warrants based on adequate probable cause at dark 30 into the homes of Governor Pritzker, Mayor Johnson, Superintendent Snelling, and all the rest of them. Perp walk them into booking, take their mugshots, arraign them on federal felony charges before a magistrate, require them to arrange for bail, require an ankle monitor as a condition of release, and then prosecute them criminally, zealously. Only then will the risk of real-world and very personal criminal consequences seem real to all the other sanctuary politicians across the nation. And only then might we see their sanctuary behaviors and policies changed consistent with the national security interest of the United States. When Pam Bondi does that, she'll have my respect. And I'll finally genuinely believe that something is actually going to be done about the 100 million illegal migrant invaders currently being allowed to simply operate in our nation. I'll close out by reminding all of you that if you carry a gun so you're hard to kill, that's why I carry a gun so I'm hard to kill, so my family is hard to kill, then you also owe it to yourself and your family to know the law so you're hard to convict as well. Until next time, I remain attorney Andrew Branca at lawofselfdefense.com. Stay safe.